So welcome to my presentation. Today I'm actually going to talk about something scientific. This is part of my PhD thesis, which I finished about 2 years ago. I'm going to talk about relational concepts and most importantly, the grounding of them. And let me give you sort of an intuition for what we mean by grounding. I think Gregor may have used that term before, but let's look at an example. So imagine that you're in a scene like this. Maybe there's a whole bunch of elephants around and you're with a friend who you can talk to. And that friend says to you, look, there's a baby elephant that's walking towards its mother. And grounding, we understand as the process that happens in your brain when you hear that language and you map it onto the right object in the scene. So you look around and at some point you find that baby elephant and you focus your attention on it. That connection, establishing the connection from language to perception, we call that the grounding process. And there is also the inverse process, which goes in the other direction, which then actually has already happened in the brain of your friend. When she says, when she looks at the scene, picks out something that she wants to talk about, and then generates language about it to inform you about something. Establishing that connection from perception to language, we call it describing, because you generate a description, right? And there's these two directions are both grounding processes. Maybe a little bit of a historic thing, grounding. You may be familiar with the grounding problem, which is a famous problem in cognitive science, and that arose from classical cognitive architectures, things like ACT-R and SOAR, if you know them. And these were models of cognition that work basically just on symbols. So this is a depiction of that. The circle would then be a cognitive system like that, and it had a whole bunch of concepts like elephant and baby and gray and so on. And all of these concepts were just symbols. In the implementation, they were actually just strings. So it would actually say elephant, and it would then do cognitive operations. And that was criticized because the meaning of these concepts wasn't specified anywhere. So there were connections between these different symbols, but it was lacking any kind of connection to sensory motor meaning. So it would lack a meaning of what does an elephant look like and move like, and how large is it, what does it smell like, that kind of thing. Or if you have a connection to language, to a word like elephant, what does that sound like? What is its connection to this symbol, right? So the grounding is really in that connection. If you look at it from a neural point of view, if you have some kind of neural population that represents the perceptual, it's a perceptual representation of an elephant, maybe here. You may also have a perceptual representation of that concept that is then maybe connected to a word like elephant. The grounding would then be in the establishing, synaptic connections between these different populations through learning mechanisms. This is what some people think of grounding. And that's part of it, but we actually go one step further and make this a bit more simple and assume that these connections are already there. So we start from this kind of picture where you have a representation of the perception, a representation of the concept itself, and there's a connection in between. And we're really interested in all the processes that are necessary to activate one from the other way around, and sort of what is necessary to support all of these processes, kind of infrastructure that is needed for it. So we call this then perceptual grounding because it has to do with the perceptual input. And I'll show you a model for this. And the model can actually do these kinds of tasks of grounding and describing, but unfortunately, it's a little simplified, so we don't work with elephants or with these really naturalistic scenes. But you've seen these before. We work with these kinds of perceptual inputs. So these are real camera videos that we use here. But the scenes are quite simplified. With a white background, we have these objects which are just colored juggling balls. In some scenes, they may be rolling around on the surface because we're also looking at movement. I'll show that in a second. But other than that, this is what the scenes look like. We also don't have real language input, like spoken language, but we simplify that as well, where the input is really in the activation of nodes. I'll show that later what that looks like, but the activation pattern in the nodes represents very simple sentences, like the red object to the left of the green object. And you'll notice that in this example here and in the example with the elephant, there are these relations in here, and this is something that we're particularly interested in. So concepts like red and green, these are quite easy because they have an explicit thing in the world that you can look for, right? If you look for a red object, it's right there, and you can just filter the image and so on. But these relational concepts to the left of, or moving toward, or is it inside of something, they don't really exist in a single object, but they exist only in the relative positions of different objects. So they only really exist in our mind by analyzing the scene. And so being able to map this onto our neural dynamic structure is something that we wanted to do. So here, even in this setting, you could still do the grounding and the description task. So grounding would mean you get this kind of input, perceptual input, and the language input, and then you would map the language onto the scene, and that would mean the system would have to find and bring into the attentional foreground the object that this language or the sentence was referring to. In this case, would be this object because it's to the left of the green object here. Or the other way around, you could have a description task where you only supply the video input, and then you have the system generate this kind of a sentence about it by activating different nodes. This works in the model both with static scenes like this, but it also works with dynamic scenes. So if you have a scene like this here, where some of these objects are moving, you could have a grounding task where you supply a sentence like the red object that's moving toward the green object, and that would then mean, oops, sorry, no, it would be this object. Or if you took the language away and just presented the video, you would have the system generate a language description of that video like that, right? Good. So this is kind of the setting. And the model that I want to present looks like this. It's quite complicated. And I'm going to go through this step by step. So at the end, hopefully, you're not supposed to understand everything, but maybe get a sense for kinds of things that we use and sort of how it connects together. You'll actually see that most of these components that I'm using here are things that you've seen before in Gregor's lectures and in other models. So we have a representation of the scene, which is fed by the camera image here, camera by the video input. We have an attentional selection mechanism, which does visual search and allows us to look for objects of certain colors and different movement directions. There's a whole bunch of things down here, which has to do with coordinate transforms. This is a representation of the different concepts of colors and movement directions, and then these relations to the left of, to the right of. This is all done with dynamic neural nodes, which you know about. And then up here is really a sequence generation architecture, which orchestrates which parts of the entire model are active and what kind of sequential cognitive operations need to be done in what order and all that. So all things that you've heard about in some context, and I'll just now push it into a single model and then kind of show you what that can do. So we'll start with this section up here with the perceptual input. So you have this kind of, this is the kind of input that we're using. And a representation of that, these objects, lives in a three-dimensional dynamic neural field, and the field is defined over, first of all, the two-dimensional space of the image, so the x and y axis of this this camera here. And then there's a third dimension, which is the color dimension, the hue dimension. So whenever you have an object, a colored object in the scene, you would have a peak in this field. And the peak, the position of the peak is determined both by the spatial position and the color of the object. And if you look here at the color dimension, you'll see that here where the green objects are in this region, if you draw a slice through that, you'll see that back here there's a peak which is from this green object, and the red object lives down here where the red objects are. The blue object is here, right? And then these are just three slices, but there's just a whole stack of them in between. There's just a three-dimensional volume. But all the other slices would be empty because right now there's only these three objects in there. So this is for representing the color and spatial position of objects. And then to do movement, we also need to know about the movement direction of the objects if they're moving. So we have a very similar setup where we have this kind of a three-dimensional field down here, but now the third dimension is not color, but movement direction. And whenever something is moving, for instance, here, I mean, this is just a static image, but in the video, the red object was actually moving from down here. So, oops, come on, from down here toward the green object. So it's moving toward the top left. And the other two objects were static. You'll see that in this three-dimensional field here, there's a single peak at sort of the position of the red object, and the movement direction is also specified, you know, by where it is along this dimension. And if you can see this small arrow here points to the top left, so that's the movement direction of this object. If you don't have any moving objects here, then there would be no activation, so no peak in that field. And it's fed through a mechanism that I'm not going to get into all the details of, but it's a neural mechanism for movement detection. It's based on transient detectors. So whenever something changes in the scene, so an object is moving, for instance, you would have a transient detector for parts of an object that are moving toward a particular position, like here, this yellow region is where the red object is now moving toward, and you have transient detectors that fire the opposite direction. So when something is moving away from that position, and if you combine these two representations, you can infer the movement direction, and that gives you kind of this picture, right? So you don't have to understand the details, but keep in mind there's a neural mechanism that does that, and we have a separate paper about that. Good. So this is the perceptual input, and then the other input that we want to use for this whole grounding idea is input from language, right? And language and linguistics is quite a complex field, so we really try to not deal with most of that. And what we want to represent are categorical concepts, and we start with the concept of colors. So we have dynamic neural nodes for every kind of color that we use in the system. Here, for instance, for red, for yellow, for green, and for blue. So there's a dynamic neural node, and you know about these even from the first exercise that we did. So these are just activation variables that can be, you know, off or on. The blue things here are activation, the green are the output. And all of these nodes are connected to a one-dimensional color field. So the dimension here is color, and this acts as this activation, just like that one. And whenever something is activated, there are synaptic weights connecting every node to this field with a certain pattern. So if I I go back here, and you'll see that when yellow is activated, that activates a certain region here that stands for yellow colors, I think around here. While other colors, yeah, there's the peak for yellow. So red, I think, is on the very left, then yellowish, then goes into green, then blue, then purple, and back to red. So blue will be somewhere around here. And the meaning of these categorical colors is then really encoded in the synaptic patterns between these nodes and this field. And this is already a form of grounding, creating meaning for these categorical things. It's not directly connected to any objects yet, but this already has some kind of perceptual meaning that we can now connect them to objects. So the next step would be to not have just these colors, but also relations. And there, the field down here is two-dimensional, which is the space of an image. And if you have to the left of, it would be sort of a region from the center out to here. This is what to the left of would mean. And toward and away are then these cones, which you'll see in a second, down here, also from the center, right? For the left, right, above, and below, these shapes are actually based on data collected with people. So this is where people were given, two different objects, and they were supposed to say, is this one to the left of that one or not? And then if you do that with a lot of people, then you get these kinds of shapes that we then model mathematically. Right? So we have representations for colors, also for movement direction, and then these categorical things for relations. Right? So now we have to kind of put these two things, these different sides together to get to actual grounding. But before we go there, for the colors, you'll notice that within a sentence like this, if I say the sentence, the red object to the left of the green object, you'll notice that the colors actually appear within one sentence in different kind of roles. So the red and the green here are different in the sense that the red object is really the one that I'm looking for in the end. We call that the target object. And the green object, you use it, but you don't look for it in the end, but you just use it as a reference point. We call that the reference object. And this needs to be represented somehow, that they're in these different kinds of roles. You couldn't just activate red, because then you wouldn't know whether it would be the target or the reference object. So we have dedicated neural representations for all colors in these two different roles. And we believe that there's probably even a few more roles that these kinds of colors can be in. Not a lot of them, maybe a handful, depending on what kind of complex relations you want to model. And you can kind of see this. So the nodes are these circles here, and you can see that there's green and red here. And down here in these columns, these stand for targets. So green as a target and red as a target. And these stand for reference. So green as a reference, red as a reference. So you actually need these dedicated representations for that in order to distinguish this. Good, so now we have the perception and we have the connection to language. And now let's go into here in the center where the grounding takes place. And this is really a simplified model of visual search, of attentional selection. Let's see what that looks like. So you have your representation of objects here in a three-dimensional field like that. And there's actually a second field which doesn't always have peaks for objects in the scene, but it gets input from perception and that input creates these little bumps here that you can see. They're all sub-threshold, so they don't create peaks by themselves, but they can create peaks if they overlap with input from language. So if let's say you activate the dynamic neural node that stands for green. That would then create a peak in this one-dimensional color field that we've seen on the 2 slides back, around here where the green colors are. And this would then add sort of a layer of heightened activation within this 3-dimensional field, which then overlaps with that little bump coming from perception and representing the green object. And this would then become a peak, only if these 2 inputs overlap in here. You can then read this out into just a spatial version of this field, which is then a spatial attention field. It can also be selective if you want, and then read out where the green object is that you are looking for. The same thing also works with movement direction. It's not in this figure, but you can maybe imagine that if something is moving to the left, top left, like here, and you have a categorical node for that movement direction, it would activate a peak here, and then you could do it analogously to this field, just for movement direction. So find an object that's moving leftward, for instance. Good. I have a small video for this, so I'll probably have to replay this. So you see the scene here. The red object is moving very, very slowly toward the green object. Right? And this one's green, this one's blue, if you can't see that correctly. And then we're activating nodes here. I think this one is we're looking for green first. So this is the green color. It highlights in this 3D field a certain region for green objects. And that extracted, let me play that again. Overlap then with activation of, that represented this green object here and highlighted in this spatial attention field the green object. You can see that here. So by saying I want the green, you get the spatial position of that green object. And the same then happens here if we activate the color concept of blue. The peak here would be at a different location, probably somewhere here. This would activate a different region in this 3D field down here before it was up here. And this would then highlight the blue object in the scene, right? And you've seen part of that in previous talks. And this is a simple mechanism that is also part of the projects that some of you are working on, which allows you to look for objects of certain features. Good. So now I've talked before about these categorical relation concepts, right? And note that if we activate to the left of, it activates a certain region here, which is always to this left of the center. And maybe you can imagine now that if we have this machinery from before, from this attentional selection, and we can say, look for the blue object. And we have this kind of a template for to the left of from here. We can maybe then overlay them and highlight, I don't know, blue objects that are on the left side, and only those should come out, right? This is a little similar to the Cedar exercise that we did. What this can't do yet is say, I want to look for a blue object that's to the left of not the center, but any kind of position within this space, right? For this, we would have to have concepts like this to the left of, which are then shifted so that they are applied to everywhere in the scene. And we would then say to the left of, I don't know, a specific position. And that's implausible to have that many copies of this, this idea of to the left of. What we do instead is we have a single representation of to the left of and to the right of and these other relations. And what we do is we move around, we shift around the spatial, the representation of the spatial positions of the objects themselves. We do that with a coordinate transform, and I'll show you what that looks like. I mean, you've heard about it before, but maybe that'll give you a more concrete idea of what that does. So if we have this kind of a scene and I want to say the red object to the left of the green, then I would have to center this left cone here onto the green object, right? And let's play that again because it's It's a little fast. So we put these two objects in two different fields. The red object goes into here because it's the target. The green goes into here. And then we have a coordinate transform that puts the relative position of the red object into here, into a space that is centered onto the green object. So if you imagine that the green is at the center, the red would be somewhere here, and it appears there in a second, hopefully. And then overlaps there and creates a peak, right? And that would actually work even if the green object, was up here or down there or there. The bump from the red object would always be just the relative position toward the green object, and would always show up here relative to the center. And then depending on whether it overlapped with this template or not, that would create a peak. If it doesn't overlap, we have a second field here, which we call the mismatch field or condition of dissatisfaction field. You can see that this is much stronger in the region that is not left. So if you imagine that maybe the red object is on the other side, it would then create a peak here while the match field doesn't create a peak. Right? And this is then a mechanism that can allow you to say, I'm building up a hypothesis, this red object is to the left, and I can now check this by looking at which of these fields creates a peak. If it's this field, then the red object is to the left. If it's this field that creates a peak, then it's not to the left. And that will become important later. I'll show you a video of where that happens. Okay, so that's this box down here. There's actually so this was one coordinate transform which just shifted around objects. There's a second coordinate transform which I don't have a video for, which is able to rotate the different objects in a movement direction space, and that actually allows you to be able to apply these relations, these movement relations toward and away, so that you can figure out whether something is moving toward another object. You meet the movement direction in there. And we'll kind of see that in one of the last videos, but it's a bit hard to visualize how that works. So what is left now is this last box up here, which is controlling cognitive operations. So which parts are active, in what order are they activated. And this is based on a concept that you've heard about before, this intention and condition of satisfaction idea, where let's call them maybe cognitive, any cognitive process within an architecture. For instance, bringing up a field so that it can create a peak, or moving a peak to a different field, things like that. Anything like this has a representation of this kind of shape, where we have 4 different dynamic neural nodes that represent that the control of this cognitive processing step, if you will. And it has these 2 parts. The intention part is really, when that is active, then the cognitive process is started, and it's doing whatever it's doing, for instance, boosting a field up to some kind of resting level that is needed. And the other part, the condition of satisfaction, COS, is the signal that has then happened, and that can, sometimes can take a long time, depending on what you're doing in the architecture. The intention can stand there for a while, and then at some point the condition of satisfaction signal comes in. There are, in my version here, 2 other nodes that I'm using. I call this the prior intention and the condition of satisfaction memory. These are really to be able to organize these different little neural network things into hierarchies and into larger structures, to be able to say, I have a cognitive operation which actually has sub operations which then do a certain sequence. And these 2 nodes allow me to do that. I'm not going to explain that. It looks kind of like this, right? You have sort of a top behavior, And then you have some wild connectivity structure here, which activates two different subnetworks. And in the model, I think I have 21 of these networks in, I think, 3 or 4 different layers. At the very top are things like ground a single object, or ground a relation, or make a description. And then on the lower levels are things like find a target object, find a reference object, and even more detailed things. You can probably imagine that you can subdivide the architecture into these little functions, let's call them. And in between these, we have structures that generate sequences, and you've heard about that. So you can specify that certain things have to happen before other things, and that's built in here with the same kinds of mechanisms that gives you sequences. Other parts that are not coupled can just run in parallel. Good. So the next thing is really 2 videos that I wanted to show you. I'll actually not do that in here because for some reason I can't control these videos. I'll just run them in my, I have them here somewhere, there. And please shout if you can't see this now. So this should now be a video. I'll make this large, and I can now explain a little better what you'll see here. So there's a whole bunch of nodes that I'll go through in a second. This is the kind of scene that we're going to look at. So there's a red object on the left, a red object on the right, and a green object in the center. And I'm now going to go through a grounding task. So I'll specify a little sentence. And the way I do this is with this window here, which is just a window in Cedar. And I click little buttons, which actually gives boost inputs to certain nodes. So if I run this, you'll see I activated red as a target. The spatial relation is to the left of, and green as a reference. And then in a second, I'm going to click on ground relation, which is then really starting the simulation, and then I can take away this window. But if you look here on the left side, you'll see that when I click these buttons, that actually activated these nodes. So you can read off here that the sentence, if you will, that it encodes now is red as a target to the left of here, green as a reference, right? So I'm actually looking for this object, right? And that's now what the model has to figure out. So I'm clicking then ground relation, I'm closing this window. What you can see here, this is the video input, then this is the one-dimensional color field. There's the fields for the target object and the reference object. Some perceptual stuff that's not as important. And then down here, I think most important is this field, the relational condition of satisfaction. This is in the end where the match is done with the spatial template. So if the left thing is on, if there's a peak there, then that means, yes, that object is to the left. And this other field here is the mismatch field, where a peak emerges if that doesn't fit. And I'll just run this. It looks at the beginning for a red object. So it activates here. This is actually supposed to be a peak. It's wrapped around these edges. So this is looking for something red. And you'll see now that here it's making a selection decision for one object, actually for the one on the right. For some reason, that's more salient. And it's putting that into this target field, right? So there's no representation of one of the red objects. And this is actually building up a hypothesis that, well, maybe he's talking about this red object. Right? At the same time, since we activated left off, you can see that the meaning of to the left of is activated here in this field, and this is the inverse, right? Not to the left. Afterward, we're looking for something green. Oh, let me point out for a second, all these things up here are these different behaviors that are active. So these are behaviors for reference, these are for targets, and you can't understand this in detail. Actually, I don't remember even what these are, but you can see that there's a lot of stuff going on and off while the whole model is behaving, right? And it's going through switches and all that stuff. So it's now looking for something green, has found something green here in the center and puts that into the reference field. I'm going to stop the simulation for a second. And now you can see that the relative position of red with respect to green is here, relative to the center, which is a bit lame because the reference object is actually in the center. But then if you overlay this with these spatial templates, you'll see that it doesn't overlap with this template to the left of, but it overlaps with the one that says not to the left of. So it will create a peak here saying this can't be right. It can't be this object because it's not to the left of the green. And this in a second will actually give a signal to sort of reset the whole process. Not in the sense of algorithmically restarting, but it's inhibiting large parts of the architecture. The only thing that remains is this language input that says, I'm looking for red to the left of the green object on the left here. And the memory, which is in this field, I haven't talked about that before. This is a memory representation of the objects that I've already tried. So it has a memory that the model has already looked at this one. And this inhibits now the selection of this one again. So now when I'm looking for something red now, it's now choosing the one on the other side, this one here. It's then looking for something green, like before, finding that in the center. And then after this happens, you'll see that this now actually overlaps with this template here, which is then a signal of, yes, this works, and this must be the right object. It does a whole lot of conditional satisfaction signals up here, and then the video ends. Let me go back to where I was before. So this is now the point where the model has achieved the grounding of that sentence input. And let me show you one more video of the other direction. So this is now a description task. Back then we used to call it parsing. So I'm not going to activate any nodes here. I'm just going to activate the entire model and say describe this or parse this. And the video input in this case is actually a moving scene where the red object is moving toward the green object. It's the same video that we looked at before. And this is very much slowed down. But the model actually generates then a language description by activating the nodes here on the left side by itself, just based on what is salient and what the relations are in the model. And I'll go through that. So I'm just activating this. The fields are the same as before, right? So a whole bunch of stuff going on up here, but it's first just activating something that is salient, and you can already see that this object that's moving is more salient than the other ones. So it's activating this and then extracting its color. So at some point, a peak will come up here from the object that is in the attention, so which is this one. So peak comes up here, and that extracts then the color into one of these nodes. So it's activating that the object that it's looking at right now is red, and also that it's moving sort of upward-ish. We only have these four different movement directions as categories, so this is closest upward. At the same time, it's detecting something is moving, so I'm looking for a movement relation, and it's already activated these two concepts of moving toward and moving away, which are in here. And this is sort of the inverse, right? It's not moving toward and it's not moving away from that. So then the next thing to do is, if we're now looking at this for the target object, what can we use as a reference? And the way that works here is by actually activating all the other objects, which will come up in a second. So all the two objects in the scene that are left are the blue and the green object, which are here and here. They both become candidates for a reference object and are then translated and rotated and so on. They actually, down here, this is now with rotation, so it's a bit hard to see. But you'll notice that one of the objects down here in this field overlaps very much with one of these templates. So the template is actually the two-word template. And the object is the green object. It's not visible here, but you'll see in a second that it actually extracts these things. So you'll see two-word is activated here over away. And it extracts a color here, which then is the color green. So before this video stops, let me say that it's now grounding. It has now grounded this or generated description of this kind of scene. You can read off what it's saying this is. So there is a red object that's moving upward, and it's moving toward a green object. Right? So if you now had some kind of a language generation system which is hooked onto these nodes, you could probably generate a sentence like that. It's somewhat complicated, but you can maybe get a gist of what that does. So this is the other direction of mapping a perceptual scene onto language, and before we've seen the other direction of grounding from language to perception.